traveller. Imagine the first light of dawn touching the stones beneath Jerusalem, revealing shadows where no footsteps should exist. Beneath layers of prayer and history, something older waits in silence. You are not here by accident. Across centuries, patterns repeat, and somehow they have led you to this moment. What if the Knights Templar did not return from Solomon's temple empty-handed, but carrying knowledge too disruptive to survive the daylight? Modern surveys have confirmed hidden cavities beneath the Temple Mount chambers, shaped with deliberate precision, sealed for nearly 3,000 years. Like a signal buried in cosmic background noise, their purpose flickers once, then vanishes, stone aligned to stars, silence shaped by design. Listen closely. Let's drift a little deeper. They claim the Knights Templar found nothing beneath Solomon's temple. Official records insist their decade in Jerusalem produced no relics, no documents, no discoveries of consequence. Yet when the order emerged from the Holy Land, it was fundamentally transformed. A small group of impoverished knights returned with sudden wealth, unprecedented political protection, and authority that bypassed kings. Such a shift does not occur in a vacuum, and history offers no comparable example of an order gaining power without acquiring something of extraordinary value. The Templars were granted residence directly above the Temple Mount, the most archaeologically sensitive ground in the ancient world. Medieval sources describe their quarters not as simple barracks, but as part of the ruins traditionally associated with the Temple of Solomon. For nearly 10 years they occupied this site in near silence. There are no surviving records of military campaigns, no evidence of extensive travel, and no documentation of traditional treasure hunting. What they possessed instead was uninterrupted access time and a location layered with more than 3,000 years of religious, political and architectural history. Archaeological and geophysical studies conducted in the modern era confirm that the ground beneath the Temple Mount is far from uniform bedrock. Subsurface surveys reveal cavities, straight-edged chambers, and anomalous voids inconsistent with natural erosion. Some of these spaces align with descriptions found in ancient texts, referring to storehouses, sealed chambers, and underground passages associated with the First Temple period. These findings suggest that the area beneath the platform was deliberately engineered, not merely built upon, indicating a tradition of subterranean architecture designed to protect something considered irreplaceable. Historical descriptions of the Temple of Solomon emphasize precision rather than ornamentation. Biblical accounts detail measurements that correspond to mathematical ratios later identified in natural systems, including proportional relationships, found in acoustics, astronomy, and structural resonance. Ancient builders understood that geometry could influence both stability and perception. Modern physics supports this principle. Enclosed spaces with specific dimensions can amplify or dampen sound effect airflow and even influence human cognition. A chamber constructed with such knowledge would not be a vault in the modern sense, but an environment designed to preserve, conceal, or control access to information. The Knights Templar were uniquely positioned to recognize this significance. Many of the Order's early members were not merely warriors, but educated men with exposure to classical knowledge preserved through Islamic scholarship. During the early 12th century, Jerusalem was a crossroads of Greek, Roman, Jewish, Christian, and Arabic intellectual traditions. Mathematics, astronomy, and engineering texts lost in Europe were actively studied in the region. If the Templars encountered an engineered subterranean structure beneath the temple, they would have understood it as something far more than a religious relic. Their subsequent behaviour supports this interpretation. The Order did not display gold or artefacts, nor did it promote miraculous discoveries. Instead, it established a financial network spanning Europe and the Near East, effectively inventing an early form of international banking. Their system relied on trust-encrypted documentation and symbolic authentication methods that appeared suddenly and fully formed. Such complexity suggests the acquisition of advanced administrative knowledge rather than material wealth. Systems, unlike objects, can be replicated without revealing their source. The reaction of the Church further complicates the narrative. Initially, the Templars were granted protections that placed them outside the authority of local rulers and bishops. They answered directly to the Pope, an arrangement without precedent. Centuries later, when the order was abruptly dismantled, the charges levelled against them were strikingly symbolic rather than criminal. Accusations centred on secret knowledge, forbidden rites, and the corruption of sacred truths. These claims, though likely exaggerated or fabricated, reflect a persistent belief that the Templars possessed information capable of undermining established religious authority. From a historical perspective, suppressed knowledge often leaves a distinct pattern. Artifacts disappear. Records fragment. Testimonies contradict. In the case of the Templars, no inventory of confiscated treasures was ever produced despite extensive trials and seizures. The absence of evidence is not neutral here. It is structural. If what the Order discovered could not be displayed, sold, or safely destroyed, containment would have been the only viable response. Information that destabilizes belief systems behaves differently from material threats. Scientific parallels reinforce this idea. In physics, certain forms of energy are not inherently destructive, yet become dangerous when uncontrolled. Radiation, for example, is invisible and persistent, requiring isolation rather than confrontation. Knowledge functions similarly. Once released, it cannot be recalled, only mitigated. If the chamber beneath Solomon's temple contained texts, instruments, or architectural proof that contradicted foundational narratives, the safest course would have been silence. Ancient civilizations repeatedly demonstrated an understanding of cyclical collapse. Flood myths reset legends, and stories of lost ages appear across cultures separated by oceans. These narratives often include references to preserved knowledge sealed away to survive catastrophe. The Temple Mount, rebuilt and repurposed across millennia, would have been an ideal location for such preservation. Elevated, fortified, and symbolically protected, it sits at the convergence of geology, mythology, and state power. The most compelling aspect of the Templar mystery is not what is claimed, but what remains unresolved. The Order did not behave like men enriched by gold, nor like zealots empowered by faith alone. They acted as custodians, careful, restrained, and increasingly isolated. When pressure mounted, they did not reveal their secret in exchange for survival. Silence endured even under torture. That consistency suggests not loyalty to an order, but recognition of a threshold that should not be crossed. History often treats silence as absence, yet in scientific investigations, silence can indicate a boundary condition. Some variables cannot be measured directly without collapsing the system itself. The sealed spaces beneath the Temple Mount may represent such a boundary. Whether the Templars encountered a physical archive, a technological remnant, or a conceptual framework lost to time, the consequences were profound enough to alter the trajectory of European history. The final secret of Solomon's Temple may not be a relic waiting to be uncovered, but a reminder that civilizations have risen, fallen, and reset before. The Knights Templar may have discovered not a treasure, but evidence that humanity has forgotten chapters of its own story. And in a world built on continuity and authority, forgetting can sometimes be the most carefully engineered outcome of all. The suppression of the Knights Templar did not erase the consequences of their discovery. Instead, it displaced them. When the order was dissolved in the early 14th century, its members vanished into other institutions, royal courts, monastic networks, and emerging financial systems. Knowledge, unlike objects, does not disappear when an organization collapses. It migrates. Traces of Templar symbolism, architectural principles, and financial practices began to surface across Europe in locations far removed from Jerusalem, suggesting a controlled diffusion rather than a sudden loss. One of the most enduring legacies attributed to the Templars is their unusual focus on sacred geometry. Cathedrals constructed in the centuries following their rise display proportions that mirror those described in ancient Near Eastern architecture rather than contemporary medieval design. These buildings emphasize resonance, alignment, and internal harmony over visual grandeur. Modern acoustic studies of such structures reveal properties that enhance low-frequency sound and induce measurable physiological effects in the human body. This is not speculation. Controlled experiments demonstrate that certain enclosed geometries can alter neural wave patterns, increasing suggestibility and emotional coherence. Architecture in this sense functions as applied physics. Such design principles were not common knowledge in medieval Europe. They reflect a deeper understanding of how space interacts with human perception. If the Templars encountered an engineered subterranean environment beneath Solomon's Temple, one designed to preserve information or influence cognition, it would explain their later obsession with proportional precision. What appears as symbolism may instead represent an attempt to replicate conditions once experienced firsthand. The historical reluctance to allow archaeological excavation beneath the Temple Mount further reinforces the idea that something beyond religious sensitivity is at stake. While the site is undeniably sacred to multiple faiths, other holy locations have undergone extensive investigation without comparable resistance. In this case, even non-invasive methods such as ground-penetrating radar have faced significant opposition. From a scientific perspective, such restrictions are unusual. When access is limited despite advances that pose no physical threat to existing structures, it suggests the presence of unresolved risk, not merely reverence. Ancient texts hint at this risk obliquely. Jewish traditions refer to objects or knowledge associated with the First Temple that were deliberately hidden rather than destroyed. These accounts do not describe wealth, but responsibility. In some versions, guardianship replaces ownership. This language mirrors how modern science treats certain discoveries, particularly those with dual-use potential. Nuclear research, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence are governed not by secrecy alone, but by controlled disclosure. The danger lies not in the existence of knowledge, but in its misapplication. If the chamber beneath Solomon's Temple contained records from a prior civilization, the implications would extend beyond theology. Evidence of advanced pre-Iron Age engineering, astronomical knowledge, or societal organization would destabilize linear models of human progress. Modern archaeology increasingly acknowledges that civilization did not emerge once and continuously advance. Göbekli Tepe, for example, demonstrates monumental construction predating agriculture by thousands of years. This alone forced a re-evaluation of how and when complex societies arise. Solomon's Temple may represent a later attempt to preserve remnants of an even older epoch. From a systems perspective, civilizations that survive repeated collapse tend to encode knowledge redundantly. They distribute fragments across myths, rituals, architecture, and oral tradition. Complete records are rare. Survivable ones are partial by design. This pattern appears globally. Flood narratives, sky alignments, and cyclical timekeeping recur with remarkable consistency across cultures. These are not merely symbolic coincidences. They suggest shared memory of disruption on a planetary scale, likely linked to climatic or cosmic events, such as comet impacts or rapid environmental shifts. Scientific models confirm that Earth has experienced such events repeatedly. Ice core data and geological strata reveal abrupt temperature changes and mass extinctions inconsistent with gradual processes. Advanced societies, if they existed prior to these resets, would have faced a choice to rebuild openly and risk erasure again, or conceal their most dangerous knowledge until conditions stabilized. A sealed chamber beneath a fortified, symbolically protected site would be an effective solution. The behavior of institutions following the Templars' downfall aligns with containment rather than ignorance. The Church did not seek to recover or reveal whatever the Order possessed. Instead, it focused on eliminating the custodians themselves. In scientific terms, this is a control strategy aimed at isolating a variable rather than studying it. When an unknown factor cannot be measured safely, removing its carriers becomes a rational, if ethically questionable, response. What remains striking is the absence of counterclaims. No rival group ever produced evidence disproving the Templars' alleged discovery. No definitive declaration was made affirming that nothing lay beneath the temple. Silence persisted, reinforced through doctrine law and geopolitical tension. Over time, the narrative solidified, the mystery became taboo rather than falsified. In academic disciplines, taboos often mark the boundary between uncertainty and institutional risk. Modern technology has reached a point where such boundaries are increasingly difficult to maintain. Satellite imaging, muon tomography, and advanced subsurface scanning now allow researchers to map underground spaces with extraordinary accuracy. Similar techniques have revealed hidden chambers in the Great Pyramid of Giza, confirming long-suspected anomalies without physical intrusion. If applied freely beneath the Temple Mount, comparable results would likely emerge. The question is not whether something would be found, but whether the consequences of finding it are acceptable. The final secret of Solomon's Temple may therefore be procedural rather than material. It may represent an ancient understanding that knowledge itself must be regulated. Not all truths are stabilizing. Some destabilize by their mere existence, forcing societies to confront discontinuity rather than progress. The Templars, having encountered such a truth, may have chosen preservation through silence replication, through architecture, and survival through dispersion. History tends to frame this as conspiracy or myth, but the pattern aligns closely with how modern scientific institutions handle existential discoveries, controlled access, fragmentation, delay, silence. These are not medieval instincts. They are human responses to uncertainty at scale. If the Templars discovered proof that civilization has risen and fallen multiple times before that humanity is not at the beginning of its story, but somewhere in the middle, the implications would extend beyond belief. They would challenge governance identity and the assumption of permanence. In that context, the destruction of the order becomes less an act of persecution and more an act of containment. The sealed chamber beneath Solomon's temple remains sealed not because it is empty, but because it is full of implications. Some discoveries do not demand revelation, they demand restraint. And the greatest legacy of the Knights Templar may not be what they found, but the decision they made to let the silence endure. The endurance of the mystery surrounding Solomon's temple suggests that its significance lies not only in what may have been hidden beneath it, but in how successive civilizations responded to the possibility of that hidden legacy. Across history, power structures have shown a consistent pattern. When confronted with knowledge that threatens foundational narratives, they choose control over clarity. The Temple Mount has remained one of the few places on Earth where time appears deliberately compressed, layered, and restricted, as if each era inherited not only the site, but also the responsibility to leave something undisturbed. From a historical standpoint, the Temple of Solomon occupied a unique position. It was not merely a religious center, but a convergence point of governance, cosmology, and law. Ancient descriptions emphasize order, balance, and alignment rather than ornamentation. The structure functioned as a symbolic model of the universe, a microcosm reflecting a larger system. This concept appears repeatedly in early civilizations, where sacred architecture was designed not to glorify rulers, but to encode principles of stability, timekeeping, and continuity. Such structures were often built atop earlier foundations, implying inheritance rather than origin. The repeated destruction and reconstruction of the temple complex reinforces this idea. Each rebuilding phase preserved the sanctity of the underlying ground, even when surface structures changed dramatically. In most archaeological contexts, destruction leads to excavation and reuse. Here it led to preservation and avoidance. This behavior contradicts economic and political incentives unless something beneath the surface carried consequences beyond material value. In scientific research, similar behavior emerges when a system is deemed too sensitive to disturb, not because it lacks importance, but because its disturbance may produce irreversible outcomes. Modern science increasingly supports the notion that ancient societies possessed a deeper understanding of long-term risk than previously assumed. Geological evidence confirms that humanity has endured abrupt climate shifts, solar events, and regional catastrophes capable of collapsing complex systems within generations. Oral traditions and mythologies often preserve distorted but consistent memories of these events. When viewed through this lens, ancient temples function less as monuments to faith, and more as anchors of continuity, preserving fragments of knowledge meant to survive cycles of collapse. If Solomon's temple was constructed to protect such fragments, its secrecy would not have been accidental. Ancient builders demonstrated awareness of information security through physical design. Hidden chambers, restricted access points, and ritualized barriers appear across cultures. These mechanisms mirror modern data containment strategies, where access is limited not by force alone, but by layers of protocol and symbolic deterrence. Sacredness in this sense operates as a psychological firewall. The Knights Templar entered this system at a moment of historical transition. Europe was emerging from fragmentation, rediscovering classical knowledge through contact with the Islamic world, and developing new financial and administrative tools. The Order's sudden sophistication cannot be explained solely by religious zeal or military discipline. Their organizational methods reflected an understanding of systems rather than hierarchies. Such thinking aligns closely with exposure to knowledge concerned with resilience cycles and continuity rather than conquest. After the dissolution of the Templars, fragments of this thinking persisted. Renaissance architects, philosophers, and scientists began to question linear progress and rediscovered ancient proportional systems. Figures such as Leonardo da Vinci explored geometry as a bridge between nature and cognition, suggesting that the universe operates according to repeating patterns rather than isolated events. This intellectual shift did not emerge from theology alone. It arose from a growing recognition that ancient knowledge had been underestimated. The resistance to investigating the Temple Mount must therefore be understood within a broader context of inherited restraint. Each authority that governed the site inherited not only religious obligations but also an implicit warning. Excavation could destabilize narratives carefully maintained for centuries. In modern terms, this resembles institutional inertia, driven by risk assessment. When the potential impact of discovery outweighs the benefits of knowledge, delay becomes policy. Technological advancement has narrowed this margin of control. Non-invasive scanning methods now offer the ability to observe without disturbing. Similar technologies have revealed unexpected voids and chambers in structures long believed to be fully understood. Each such discovery has forced revisions to accepted timelines. If applied beneath the Temple Mount, these methods would likely produce results that cannot be easily contextualized within existing frameworks. The reluctance to proceed suggests anticipation, not ignorance. The question then shifts from what lies beneath Solomon's Temple to why its silence has been preserved so effectively. In science, the most enduring mysteries often persist, not because they are unsolvable, but because their solutions demand paradigm shifts. The transition from a geocentric to a heliocentric model reshaped humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The acceptance of deep time transformed biology and geology. Discoveries that redefine origins tend to destabilize identity before they enrich understanding. If the temple concealed evidence of a prior advanced civilization, or even proof of repeated societal resets, the implications would extend beyond archaeology. Such evidence would challenge assumptions about uniqueness, progress, and destiny. It would suggest that humanity is neither the first nor the final iteration of complexity on this planet. That realization carries psychological weight, comparable to the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence. In that context, the actions of the Knights Templar appear less mysterious and more consistent. They may have encountered not a secret meant to be revealed, but one meant to be endured. Their silence, dispersion, and eventual eradication reflect the difficulty of carrying knowledge that cannot be openly shared. History records their downfall as tragedy or conspiracy, yet it may also represent the final stage of a containment process, initiated long before their arrival. The final secret of Solomon's Temple may never be reduced to a single artifact or document. It may instead represent a boundary between eras, a deliberate pause in humanity's narrative. Some knowledge is not lost because it is fragile, but because it is powerful enough to alter the course of civilizations. The enduring silence beneath the Temple Mount suggests that restraint, not revelation, was chosen repeatedly across millennia. In that sense, the temple stands not as a monument to what humanity once believed, but as a marker of what it has chosen not to remember. As inquiry moves further from legend and closer to structure, the enduring restraint surrounding Solomon's Temple begins to resemble a long-term strategy rather than an unresolved curiosity. Across civilizations, the preservation of certain sites has depended less on reverence and more on caution. When a location repeatedly resists excavation, despite political upheaval, religious transformation, and technological progress, it suggests the presence of constraints that transcend any single era. The Temple Mount appears to be governed by such constraints maintained not by consensus but by inherited hesitation. In archaeology, absence can be as meaningful as presence. Entire cultures are reconstructed from fragments because those fragments survive disruption. At the Temple Mount, the inverse is true. Evidence may exist, but access is restricted. This inversion challenges conventional methods of historical reconstruction and raises the possibility that the site functions as a deliberate discontinuity in the archaeological record. In scientific terms, it resembles a controlled variable, intentionally isolated to prevent interference with a larger system. The idea that ancient societies practice selective preservation aligns with emerging research into early risk management. Studies of ancient flood defences, seismic architecture and astronomical observation show that long-term thinking was not uncommon. Certain structures were designed not only to endure disasters, but to encode responses to them. Temples in this framework served as repositories of procedural knowledge rather than static monuments. Their design reflected an understanding of recurrent cycles of destruction and recovery that demanded continuity beyond written language. If Solomon's Temple belonged to this category, its most valuable contents may not have been objects but frameworks. Geometry, proportion, orientation, and material selection would have been integral to such a system. These elements persist even when inscriptions are erased and artifacts removed. Modern physics increasingly acknowledges that structure influences function. Resonant symmetry and spatial configuration affect energy flow acoustics and even human perception. Ancient builders may have recognized these effects, empirically embedding them into sacred architecture without formalized theory. This perspective reframes the temple as an interface rather than a vault. Instead of hiding something inert, it may have regulated interaction between knowledge and society. Access would be limited not to prevent theft, but to prevent misuse. In contemporary terms, this resembles ethical containment in scientific research, where certain experiments are restricted due to potential consequences. Knowledge is not inherently benign. Its impact depends on context, readiness, and intent. The historical aftermath of the temple's destruction supports this interpretation. Rather than triggering widespread dissemination of hidden knowledge, its fall coincided with fragmentation and doctrinal consolidation. Religious systems emphasized obedience and revelation over inquiry and structure. This shift may reflect a conscious move away from systems-based understanding toward narrative-based authority. Such transitions often follow periods of instability when control becomes a priority over exploration. The Knights Templar emerged during a partial reversal of this trend. Exposure to Islamic scholarship reintroduced Europe to mathematics, astronomy, and classical philosophy. The Templars' apparent interest in architecture, finance, and logistics suggests alignment with systemic thinking, rather than purely theological motivation. Their rapid rise and equally rapid suppression illustrate the tension between institutional power and distributed knowledge. When an organization accumulates influence without transparency, it attracts suspicion regardless of intent. Following their dissolution, the diffusion of architectural innovation across Europe suggests that whatever the Templars encountered was not centralized after their fall. Instead, it fragmented, embedded in guilds, traditions, and symbolic systems. Gothic cathedrals with their precise proportions and light manipulation reflect an understanding of space that transcends aesthetic preference. These structures function as experiential environments, shaping perception through geometry and sound. Such design principles imply continuity with earlier sacred architecture traditions. Modern neuroscience has begun to explore how built environments influence cognition. Spatial symmetry, rhythmic repetition, and acoustic resonance can induce calm focus and altered states of awareness. If ancient temples were designed with similar effects in mind, their purpose may have extended beyond worship into cognitive regulation. In this context, Solomon's Temple could be interpreted as an early attempt to align human perception with environmental order, reinforcing social stability through embodied experience rather than doctrine. The reluctance to excavate beneath the Temple Mount may therefore stem from more than political sensitivity. Disrupting a system designed to regulate perception could have unintended consequences. Even today, large-scale changes to cultural symbols can destabilize collective identity. Scientific discoveries that alter origin stories such as evolution or cosmology often encounter resistance not because they are false, but because they challenge deeply held frameworks of meaning. If the temple encoded a model of reality incompatible with later theological developments, preserving its silence may have been a pragmatic choice. Over time, silence becomes tradition, and tradition becomes law. The site's layered restrictions reflect this evolution, transforming caution into doctrine. Each generation inherits not only the prohibition, but the rationale, often without direct knowledge of its origin. Technological advances now challenge this inheritance. Ground, penetrating radar muon tomography, and other non-invasive techniques reduce the risk of disturbance while increasing the likelihood of discovery. Similar methods have revealed hidden chambers in pyramids and ancient cities, forcing re-evaluations of long-held assumptions. Applying these tools beneath the Temple Mount would likely yield data that demands interpretation beyond existing narratives. The hesitation to proceed suggests awareness of this potential. In science, the most disruptive discoveries are often anticipated before they are confirmed. Researchers recognize when a finding may require revising foundational theories. Institutions, whether scientific or religious, respond by slowing the process, emphasizing peer review, or limiting access. These mechanisms are not inherently suppressive, they are stabilizing. The final secret of Solomon's Temple may thus reside not in what it contains, but in what it represents a boundary between eras of understanding. Its preservation reflects an ongoing negotiation between curiosity and caution, between the desire to know and the responsibility to maintain coherence. History shows that when such boundaries are crossed, abruptly societies struggle to adapt. In this light, the Temple Mount stands as a reminder that knowledge carries weight. Some discoveries illuminate, others destabilize. The silence surrounding Solomon's Temple suggests that ancient builders and later custodians understood this distinction. They chose endurance over disclosure, continuity over revelation. Whether that choice will persist in the age of advanced technology remains uncertain, but its longevity speaks to a deliberate restraint rarely acknowledged in the study of history. The persistence of secrecy surrounding the Temple of Solomon becomes even more striking when examined through the lens of comparative history. Across cultures, sites associated with foundational knowledge often undergo a similar transformation: initial openness followed by restriction, and finally ritualized silence. This pattern appears in ancient Egyptian priesthoods, Mesopotamian scribal schools, and later in medieval monastic archives. What begins as functional knowledge gradually becomes guarded, then symbolic, and eventually untouchable. The temple fits precisely within this trajectory. One explanation lies in the relationship between knowledge and authority. Early societies frequently embedded practical understanding astronomy, measurement acoustics within sacred contexts to ensure continuity and respect. Over time, as political structures solidified, the same knowledge could threaten centralized power by offering alternative frameworks of legitimacy. A system that explains order through geometry and natural law does not require absolute intermediaries. It empowers those who can observe, measure, and replicate. This makes it inherently destabilizing to institutions built on exclusive revelation. Historical texts describing the temple emphasize precision rather than ornamentation. Measurements are repeated with unusual insistence. Materials are specified not for beauty alone, but for placement and proportion. This level of detail suggests functional intent. In engineering terms, redundancy in description often indicates sensitivity systems that fail, if altered, require exact replication. Ancient builders may have understood that even minor deviations could disrupt the intended effect, whether acoustic, symbolic, or social. The destruction of the temple did not erase these principles, it scattered them. Knowledge tied to place becomes migratory once the place is lost. Fragments appear in later traditions stripped of context but retaining form. Sacred geometry resurfaces in Islamic architecture, Gothic cathedrals, and Renaissance design theory. While separated by doctrine, these structures share ratios and spatial logic that hint at a common inheritance rather than independent invention. From a scientific standpoint, this continuity is significant. Independent rediscovery across cultures typically produces variation. Convergent design, by contrast, implies transmission. When the same proportional systems appear repeatedly across time and geography, it suggests that the underlying model was preserved, even if its origin story was obscured. The temple may have functioned as a primary node in this transmission network, anchoring a set of principles later distributed through less conspicuous means. The modern reluctance to disturb what remains beneath the temple mount can be interpreted as an extension of this preservation strategy. Excavation is irreversible. Once context is lost, interpretation becomes speculative. In fields like archaeology and geology, premature exposure can destroy stratigraphic integrity, erasing the very information sought. The stakes are higher at sites where findings could alter not just academic understanding, but cultural and religious identity. There is also the issue of interpretation itself. Data does not speak without a framework. Discoveries that fall outside prevailing narratives often provoke resistance because they demand new explanatory models. The history of science is filled with such moments: heliocentrism, deep time evolution. Each required society to recalibrate its sense of place in the universe. If the temple encoded a worldview grounded in cycles, proportion, and recurrence, rather than linear revelation, its re-emergence could necessitate a similar recalibration. Technological progress intensifies this tension. Non-invasive imaging techniques now allow researchers to detect anomalies without physical intrusion. Preliminary scans beneath contested sites elsewhere have revealed chambers, voids, and structural complexity far beyond surface assumptions. Should comparable evidence emerge beneath the temple mount, it would challenge long-standing claims that nothing of significance remains. The question would no longer be whether something is there, but how to integrate it into existing frameworks. Integration, not discovery, is often the more difficult task. Societies can absorb new facts more easily than new meanings. A physical artifact can be catalogued. A systemic insight requires reinterpretation of history, belief, and authority. This may explain why silence persists even as technology advances. Delay becomes a method of adaptation, allowing time for potential impact to be assessed. The temple's enduring mystery thus reflects a broader human pattern. Knowledge that reshapes foundational assumptions is rarely welcomed immediately. It is negotiated, resisted, reframed, and sometimes buried again. Yet the persistence of patterns tied to the temple suggests that complete erasure was never the goal. Instead, the knowledge was transformed into something more resilient form, rather than text, proportion rather than proclamation. In this sense, the temple has never truly been lost. Its influence survives in stone space and structure across continents. What remains uncertain is whether modern inquiry will recognize this continuity as intentional or dismiss it as coincidence. The answer may depend less on what lies beneath the temple mount and more on whether contemporary society is prepared to encounter a model of the past that emphasizes systems over stories. As attention turns from architecture to consequence, the historical pattern surrounding the temple begins to resemble a long-term containment event rather than a lost chapter. In science, containment is rarely about destruction. It is about control of exposure. Radioactive material is not erased, it is isolated. Pathogens are not denied, they are quarantined. The same logic appears to have governed the treatment of knowledge associated with the temple. Instead of public refutation or full preservation, it was sealed behind layers of doctrine, geography, and inherited prohibition. This approach becomes clearer when examining how later religious systems position the temple in narrative terms. It was revered yet unreachable, central yet functionally absent. This paradox allowed it to retain symbolic authority, while preventing direct engagement with its underlying structure. In historical systems of power, this is a stable configuration. A symbol can unify without explaining. Explanation invites replication. Replication invites decentralization. The transition from temple-based practice to text-based religion marks a critical shift. Text is portable, editable, and interpretable through authority. Architecture is fixed, experiential, and resistant to reinterpretation once encountered directly. The move towards scripture-centric belief systems coincides with the loss of access to sites where meaning was encoded spatially rather than verbally. This is not unique to one tradition. Similar transitions occurred in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and the Indus Valley, where monumental centers were abandoned and ritual knowledge condensed into priestly transmission. What may have been lost in that transition was not spirituality, but calibration. Spatial systems anchor belief to measurable reality. Sun paths sound behavior bodily movement through space. Text abstracts belief, separating it from environment. This abstraction is powerful, but it also allows divergence between doctrine and experience. Over time, belief becomes something learned rather than felt. The temple's design, if it functioned as a calibration system, would have resisted this abstraction. The historical suppression of groups associated with temple knowledge follows a predictable pattern. Organizations that preserve non-textual systems of meaning, geometry proportion initiation through experience often attract suspicion. Their knowledge cannot be audited easily, it cannot be summarized, it must be encountered. From a governance perspective, this is destabilizing. Authority prefers systems that can be standardized and enforced through language. This tension helps explain why the legacy of the temple appears fragmented rather than continuous. Instead of a single lineage preserving its function, traces emerge in multiple domains: architecture, music theory, cosmology, and later even natural philosophy. Each domain retains part of the system stripped of its original integration. What remains is coherence without context, a recognizable pattern, without an agreed explanation. Modern science offers an interesting parallel. As disciplines specialize, holistic understanding becomes harder to maintain. Physics, biology, neuroscience, and cosmology describe different layers of reality, often using incompatible languages. Yet beneath this fragmentation, certain mathematical structures recur. Ratios, harmonics, and symmetries appear across scales. This recurrence suggests that ancient integrative systems may have been less naive than often assumed. They may have approached reality as a unified field long before such language existed. The temple's silence then may represent the collapse of an integrative model rather than the loss of isolated facts. Once the model could no longer be maintained intact, its components were distributed, encoded, or ritualized. Silence preserved coherence where explanation would have failed. This strategy is evident in other contexts. Complex technologies are sometimes lost not because they are destroyed, but because their supporting systems disappear. Without infrastructure, knowledge becomes unusable. Contemporary interest in the temple often focuses on objects, the Ark Scroll's relics. This focus may itself be a misunderstanding. Objects are easier to imagine and easier to control. Systems are harder. A system that teaches how to align human perception with environmental cycles, or how to encode memory into space, cannot be locked away once understood. It must either be taught responsibly or contained completely. History suggests containment was chosen. This choice carries ethical implications. Who decides when humanity is ready for certain knowledge? In modern contexts, similar debates occur around artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and nuclear physics. The fear is not ignorance but premature application. Knowledge released without context can be more destructive than ignorance sustained with stability. Ancient custodians may have faced analogous dilemmas, framed in different language but grounded in the same concern. The Temple Mount's continued inaccessibility reflects the persistence of that dilemma. Political, religious, and cultural explanations overlap, but beneath them lies a simpler truth. Reopening a system without understanding its function risks unintended consequences. Even today, excavation protocols emphasize minimal intervention. Disturbance is justified only when the interpretive framework is robust enough to absorb new data. The question then is not what was hidden, but why restraint endured for so long. Restraint requires consensus across generations, even as belief systems change. That consensus suggests that something about the temple's underlying function was recognized repeatedly, even if its specifics were forgotten. Memory persisted as caution. As scientific tools become more sophisticated, the likelihood of indirect discovery increases. Patterns detected through remote sensing or comparative analysis may eventually force reinterpretation without physical intrusion. This would align with the historical preference for observation over disruption. Knowledge re-emerging through pattern recognition rather than excavation would mirror the way it was originally preserved. In that sense, the temple's legacy may already be unfolding. Each rediscovery of ancient proportional systems, each recognition of resonance in architecture, each convergence between physics and perception, brings fragments of the original model back into view, not as revelation, but as gradual alignment. The enduring silence surrounding the temple is not an absence of history. It is history operating through restraint. Whether that restraint will continue depends less on what lies beneath stone than on how modern society chooses to integrate complexity. Some systems cannot be rushed. Some knowledge reveals itself only when observation matures into understanding. As the long arc of inquiry continues, a different interpretation begins to surface, one less concerned with what was concealed and more focused on what was allowed to persist. Across history, when a structure or system survives not through preservation but through avoidance, it often signals a recognition that its full meaning cannot be safely reduced. The temple's endurance and absence suggest that it functioned as a reference point rather than a repository. It anchored something conceptual, not material. Civilizations rarely erase foundational systems entirely. They fragment them. This fragmentation allows continuity without comprehension. The temple's influence appears to have followed this route. Instead of a single lineage preserving its purpose, traces emerge across unrelated traditions, each carrying partial functionality. Geometry without origin, ritual without explanation, symbol without context. This dispersion acts as a stabilizing mechanism, preventing any one group from reassembling the whole too quickly. From a systems perspective, this resembles fault tolerance. Complex systems designed to survive disruption often distribute critical components rather than centralize them. If one node fails, the system persists in degraded but recoverable form. The temple's disappearance may have initiated such a distribution. Its principles, measurement, alignment, proportion reappear independently embedded in practices that appear symbolic but retain operational value. Architecture offers the clearest evidence of this process. Buildings influenced by temple-derived ratios continue to shape human experience regardless of belief. Light enters at precise angles. Sound behaves predictably. Movement through space induces calm or focus. These effects do not require faith. They are physiological responses to structure. Even stripped of narrative, the system functions. This may explain why its remnants survived in secular contexts long after theological explanations faded. The persistence of these effects suggests that the temple's original framework addressed a universal aspect of human perception. Modern research into environmental psychology and neuroarchitecture supports this idea. Spatial order, symmetry, and rhythm influence cognition and emotional regulation. Certain environments reliably reduce stress or enhance concentration. Ancient builders operating without modern instrumentation appear to have arrived at similar conclusions through observation and iteration. If the temple represented an early synthesis of these insights, its loss would not eliminate their validity. It would only obscure their origin. Subsequent cultures rediscovered fragments independently, often attributing them to divine inspiration or aesthetic preference. Over time, the underlying system became mythologized. Myth preserved memory without precision, ensuring survival without replication. This dynamic reframes the question of secrecy. What appears as concealment may have been a controlled degradation. By allowing only partial transmission, ancient custodians ensured that no single generation could wield the system's full potential without rediscovering its logic independently. This approach prioritizes resilience over control. It assumes that true understanding cannot be inherited directly. It must be earned through rediscovery. Such an approach aligns with how complex scientific knowledge evolves. Foundational principles persist, but applications change. Each era reconstructs understanding using available tools and language. When continuity is broken, rediscovery often occurs along different paths converging on similar results. This convergence lends credibility to the original model without requiring direct lineage. The temple's role in this process may have been catalytic rather than terminal. Its disappearance forced decentralization. Decentralization reduced risk. No single authority could monopolize the system. Instead, it became woven into culture itself, subtle, persistent, difficult to eradicate. The very lack of clarity surrounding its purpose ensured longevity. This interpretation challenges the assumption that ancient secrecy was primarily defensive. It suggests a more nuanced strategy, preservation through dispersion. Knowledge too powerful to centralize was allowed to dissolve into patterns that could be reassembled only under favorable conditions. Silence was not imposed to hide truth, but to prevent premature synthesis. The modern era may represent such a condition. Advances in physics, neuroscience, and systems theory increasingly converge on principles long embedded in sacred architecture. Resonance symmetry and scale invariance now describe phenomena from quantum fields to cosmic structure. The language is different, but the patterns align. What was once encoded spatially is now modelled mathematically. This convergence raises an important possibility. The temple's legacy may not require excavation to be realised. Its system may already be re-emerging through independent lines of inquiry. As disciplines reconnect, fragments align. Architecture meets cognition. Physics meets perception. Geometry meets biology. The original synthesis becomes visible not as recovered artifact, but as emergent coherence. In this light, the Temple Mount's continued silence appears less obstructive and more irrelevant. The system it anchored no longer depends on that location alone. Its principles have propagated. The question shifts from what lies beneath stone to whether contemporary frameworks can integrate what has already resurfaced. History suggests that integration is the final and most difficult phase. Rediscovery without synthesis produces novelty without understanding. Synthesis requires humility, the recognition that modern insight may echo ancient observation rather than surpass it. This humility has often been absent in periods of rapid advancement leading to cycles of overreach and correction. The temple's story then may serve as a cautionary model. Knowledge that alters foundational perception demands gradual assimilation. Abrupt exposure destabilizes. Distributed rediscovery stabilizes. Silence in this context is not denial but pacing. Whether modern society is prepared for synthesis remains uncertain. The pieces are visible. The patterns are recognizable. What is missing is consensus on meaning. Until that emerges, restraint may persist, not enforced by guardians, but by complexity itself. Some systems reveal their full structure only when observation matures into coherence. As the fragments continue to align, attention naturally shifts from preservation to recurrence. Throughout history, systems that survive catastrophic disruption often do so by reappearing in altered form. They do not return intact, they return translated. The temple's influence appears to follow this rule. Rather than resurfacing as a reconstructed building or recovered archive, it manifests as repeated rediscovery of the same structural principles under different names and disciplines. What was once embedded in stone now appears in equations, models and theories that describe reality at vastly different scales. In geology, this process is known as re-emergence. A buried structure does not vanish. It exerts pressure upward, reshaping the surface over time. Fault lines, uplifted strata, and anomalous formations reveal what lies beneath without direct exposure. Cultural systems behave similarly. Foundational ideas exert influence long after their origin is obscured. The temple viewed this way becomes a tectonic feature in the landscape of knowledge rather than a missing artifact. Modern cosmology offers an unexpected parallel. The universe itself appears structured around ratios and harmonics. Orbital resonances stabilize planetary systems. Spiral galaxies follow predictable curves. Even cosmic background radiation carries patterns that hint at an underlying order. These discoveries did not arise from myth, yet they echo ancient intuitions about proportion and alignment. The language has changed, but the mathematics has not. This raises a critical question. Did ancient builders intuitively grasp aspects of this order through observation and embodied experience? Without telescopes or particle accelerators, they relied on long-term pattern recognition. Seasonal cycles, acoustic behavior in enclosed spaces, the movement of light across stone. These were measurable with patience rather than instrumentation. Over generations, such observations could crystallize into architectural systems that reflected universal regularities. The temple may have been one such crystallization. Its design, repeatedly described as precise rather than decorative, suggests a deliberate attempt to mirror order rather than symbolize it. In this sense, it functioned less as a representation of belief and more as a demonstration of coherence. Standing within it may have offered a direct experience of alignment between body, environment, and cosmos, without the need for explanation. As society shifted toward abstraction, that experiential knowledge became harder to transmit. Text cannot reproduce sensation. Diagram cannot replicate resonance. What was once felt became narrated, and narration inevitably simplifies. Over time, the original function receded behind layers of interpretation, yet the underlying principles remained embedded wherever similar structures were built, even unintentionally. This persistence explains why later architectural traditions occasionally produced effects their builders could not fully explain. Cathedrals that calm the mind, spaces that amplify sound in unexpected ways, layouts that orient human movement towards stillness. These outcomes were often attributed to divine presence or artistic genius, but they may instead reflect inherited structural logic operating below conscious awareness. In contemporary research, this logic is resurfacing through interdisciplinary convergence. Neuroscience confirms that spatial geometry influences neural activity. Physics reveals that resonance governs stability across systems. Information theory shows that pattern compression preserves meaning more efficiently than narrative repetition. These findings do not validate ancient myth, but they do validate ancient method observation, iteration, and structural encoding. The temple's disappearance thus appears less like a loss, and more like a phase change. Its function transitioned from centralized embodiment to distributed influence. Once distributed, it could no longer be controlled or erased. It became part of the substrate of culture, quietly shaping environments and experiences without requiring belief. This diffusion also explains why attempts to locate a single secret often fail. There may be no discrete revelation waiting beneath stone. Instead, there is a network of relationships between space and perception, between proportion and stability, that cannot be extracted as an object. Trying to isolate such a system would be like attempting to remove gravity from physics. It is not stored anywhere, it operates everywhere. The continued fascination with uncovering a hidden chamber may therefore reflect a misunderstanding of how foundational systems persist. We are conditioned to seek artifacts because artifacts fit within museum logic. Systems do not. They must be learned, not found. The temple's enduring silence may be a consequence of this mismatch between expectation and reality. If so, then modern inquiry is approaching the subject from the wrong direction. Rather than asking what was hidden, the more productive question becomes what was learned and how it was preserved without explanation. This reframing shifts focus from excavation to interpretation, from recovery to synthesis. Such synthesis is inherently slow. It requires bridging disciplines that evolved separately. It requires tolerating ambiguity rather than resolving it prematurely. Ancient systems often encoded knowledge in ways that resist linear explanation precisely to prevent misuse. Understanding them demands patience and humility, qualities not easily rewarded in competitive intellectual environments. The re-emergence of temple-like principles in modern science suggests that rediscovery is already underway. Each alignment between ancient proportion and contemporary theory narrows the gap between past and present understanding. What remains is not proof, but integration. Integration cannot be forced. It emerges when frameworks mature enough to accommodate complexity. In this context, the Temple Mount's silence may serve as a stabilizing absence. By withholding definitive answers, it prevents premature closure. It keeps inquiry open-ended, encouraging distributed exploration rather than singular revelation. This is consistent with systems designed to outlast individual civilizations. They do not announce themselves, they wait to be recognized. Recognition, when it comes, may feel anticlimactic. There may be no dramatic unveiling, no singular moment of discovery. Instead, there will be a gradual realization that the patterns have been visible all along, embedded in buildings' equations and even in the way human perception responds to order. The temple's legacy would then be understood not as a secret kept, but as a structure remembered without words. Such an outcome would align with the deepest lesson history offers, that enduring knowledge does not shout. It persists quietly, shaping thought and experience across generations, indifferent to whether it is named or claimed. The temple in this sense may never need to be uncovered. It has already done what it was built to do, carry a model of order forward, until those capable of recognizing it arrive. As the inquiry reaches its final stage, the enduring question is no longer whether the temple concealed something extraordinary, but whether humanity has repeatedly misunderstood the nature of what endures. History often treats permanence as physical survival stone that remains texts that persist, artifacts that can be catalogued. Yet the most resilient systems are rarely material. They are structural. They persist by shaping how humans think, build, and perceive, even when their origin has been forgotten. The temple's apparent disappearance may therefore mark a transition, rather than a conclusion. What ended was not a system of knowledge, but its centralized embodiment. Once removed from a single location, its principles could no longer be controlled by any authority. They became implicit rather than explicit, operating beneath awareness, rather than through instruction. This transformation ensured survival at the cost of clarity. Civilizations tend to mistake clarity for progress. We assume that understanding requires articulation, that knowledge must be spoken to be real. Yet many functional systems operate precisely because they are not verbalized. Language simplifies, systems integrate. Ancient builders working without formal abstraction encoded understanding directly into space proportion and movement. Their legacy survives wherever those encodings still shape human experience. The temple's influence traced through architecture, geometry, and later scientific insight suggests that it belonged to this category. Its design appears to have been less about belief than alignment between human scale and cosmic pattern, between perception and order. Such alignment does not announce itself. It is felt, not declared. When societies shifted toward doctrinal authority, this form of knowledge became inconvenient. It could not be debated or controlled. It simply worked. What followed was not destruction, but reinterpretation. Ritual replaced calibration. Symbol replaced function. Over time, the original system became invisible, even as its effects persisted. People continued to respond to spaces shaped by proportions and resonance, unaware of why those spaces felt different. The temple's absence thus created a paradox. Its influence grew precisely because its explanation vanished. Modern science has begun to circle back toward this realization. As reductionist approaches reach their limits, interdisciplinary research reveals that many phenomena cannot be understood in isolation. Consciousness, climate, and complex systems resist linear explanation. They require models that account for interaction, feedback, and scale. These are the very qualities ancient systems appear to have encoded without formal theory. The recurring convergence between ancient proportion and modern mathematics is unlikely to be coincidental. It suggests that certain structures reflect fundamental properties of reality rather than cultural preference. When such structures are rediscovered independently, they tend to produce similar effects regardless of context. This universality is the hallmark of a robust system. If the temple represented an early synthesis of these insights, its disappearance may have been necessary for their long-term survival. Centralized systems invite control and suppression. Distributed systems adapt. By dissolving into fragments, the temple's framework became resilient to ideological shifts. No single authority could erase it because no single authority fully possessed it. This interpretation reframes the notion of secrecy. Secrecy implies intent to hide. What emerges here is closer to intentional ambiguity. Ambiguity protects systems that cannot be safely simplified. It forces engagement through rediscovery rather than instruction. Those who encounter the system must reconstruct its logic themselves, ensuring comprehension rather than imitation. Such a strategy carries an implicit trust in future observers. It assumes that understanding will re-emerge when conditions are right, when tools, language, and perspective mature enough to integrate complexity. Until then, the system remains dormant, influencing subtly without revealing itself fully. The Temple Mount's continued silence fits this model. Its inaccessibility preserves ambiguity. It prevents premature closure, allowing inquiry to remain distributed rather than definitive. In scientific terms, it maintains an open system. Closure would impose a single narrative-freezing interpretation. Silence allows multiple lines of investigation to proceed independently. As modern inquiry advances, the likelihood increases that synthesis will occur without excavation. Patterns recognized across disciplines may converge into a coherent framework that mirrors what was once embodied in stone. At that point, the temple's physical absence becomes irrelevant. Its function has been fulfilled. This outcome challenges deeply held assumptions about discovery. We expect breakthroughs to arrive as events. In reality, the most transformative insights often emerge gradually through alignment rather than revelation. They are recognized rather than announced. When recognition occurs, it feels inevitable, even obvious in hindsight. The temple's legacy then may not culminate in a dramatic uncovering, but in a quiet convergence of understanding. When modern science architecture and cognition align around principles long embedded in ancient systems, the past re-enters the present without spectacle. History closes a loop rather than opening a door. In this sense, the final secret of the temple is not hidden beneath stone. It is embedded in the continuity of human inquiry. It suggests that civilizations rise and fall, but certain structures of understanding persist, waiting to be recognized again. Knowledge does not always survive by being preserved. Sometimes it survives by being forgotten, until forgetting itself becomes the condition for rediscovery. At the end of this long inquiry, the question that remains is not whether Solomon's temple hid a forbidden object, but whether humanity has consistently misidentified the most enduring form of knowledge. Across history, what survives is rarely what is guarded most tightly. It is what is embedded most deeply. Stone crumbles, texts burn, institutions fall, yet certain patterns persist, shaping thought and behavior long after their origin is forgotten. The temple appears to belong to this category, not as a container of secrets, but as a mechanism for continuity. If this is true, then the centuries of restraint surrounding the Temple Mount take on a different meaning. Silence was not enforced to protect a fragile truth, but to allow a durable one to operate without distortion. Knowledge that functions as a system cannot be extracted without damage. Once removed from its structural context, it becomes doctrine, symbol, or superstition. By remaining inaccessible, the temple avoided being reduced. It retained coherence by remaining whole even in absence. This challenges the modern assumption that progress depends on exposure. In scientific culture, openness is rightly valued, yet even here limits exist. Certain data sets are restricted. Certain experiments are delayed. Ethical review boards exist precisely because premature knowledge can outpace responsibility. Ancient custodians may have recognized a similar imbalance long before the language of ethics was formalized. Their solution was not censorship, but postponement. Postponement operates on a different timescale. It assumes that understanding matures cyclically, not linearly. Civilizations reach moments of expansion, followed by consolidation, then collapse. In each cycle, some knowledge becomes dangerous not because it is false, but because it is true in a context unprepared to integrate it. The temple's disappearance may coincide with such a moment when structural understanding exceeded social capacity. Evidence of this mismatch appears repeatedly in history. Technological advances often outstrip ethical frameworks. Political systems struggle to adapt to new forms of power. Knowledge that could stabilize systems instead accelerates collapse when applied without restraint. From this perspective, silence is not ignorance. It is risk management. The temple's apparent role as a calibration structure reinforces this idea. If it aligned perception, environment, and cosmic rhythm, then its function depended on collective participation and cultural context. Removed from that context, its principles could not be safely operationalized. The loss of the temple was therefore not simply architectural. It marked the breakdown of a shared framework capable of sustaining such a system. What followed was fragmentation. Elements of the system survived independently: geometry and architecture, harmony in music, proportion in art, cyclic time in myth. Each fragment retained validity, but none could reconstitute the whole alone. This fragmentation prevented misuse while preserving potential. The system went dormant, not extinct. Modern science now finds itself approaching similar insights from a different direction. Complexity theory systems, biology, and network science all converge on the idea that stability emerges from relationship rather than hierarchy. Feedback, resonance, and proportion govern behavior across scales. These principles are not new, they're newly articulated. What ancient builders encoded spatially, modern researchers model mathematically. This convergence suggests that rediscovery is already occurring independent of archaeology. The temple's framework, if it existed as a system of alignment, no longer requires physical recovery. It can be inferred through pattern recognition across disciplines. In this sense, the temple was never meant to be reopened. It was meant to be outgrown. Outgrowing does not mean surpassing. It means reaching a stage where integration becomes possible again. Integration requires tools capable of handling complexity without oversimplification. It also requires cultural maturity, the ability to hold uncertainty without forcing resolution. Ancient systems often failed when societies demanded certainty too quickly. The temple's silence may have been a safeguard against that impulse. The fascination with uncovering a final answer reflects a desire for closure. Yet closure can be misleading. Systems that endure rarely offer conclusions, they offer orientation. They help societies navigate uncertainty rather than eliminate it. If the temple served this role, its absence may be as instructive as its presence once was. In this light, the long history of restraint surrounding the Temple Mount becomes a form of collective memory. Even when the reason for restraint was forgotten, the behaviour persisted. This is how complex systems transmit caution, not through explanation but through tradition. The result is a boundary that remains intact long after its origin is obscured. The final implication is unsettling but clarifying. Humanity may already possess what it seeks. The question is not whether ancient knowledge will be revealed, but whether modern society can recognize it when it reappears in unfamiliar form. Recognition requires synthesis across science, history, and human experience. It cannot be achieved through excavation alone. If the temple's legacy is one of distributed continuity, then its true inheritance lies not beneath stone but within patterns humanity continues to rediscover. Architecture that calms without instruction, mathematics that mirrors nature, systems that favour balance over dominance, these are not relics, they are active principles. The story of Solomon's temple then does not end with revelation. It ends with responsibility. Knowledge that survives collapse does so because it adapts, not because it hides. Silence was not the absence of truth, but its incubation. Whether modern civilization is capable of integrating what has quietly endured remains an open question. In the end, the final secret is not what was found, but what was preserved by not being found too soon. As the inquiry reaches its true conclusion, it becomes clear that the story of Solomon's temple is less about discovery than about inheritance. Civilizations do not merely pass down objects or texts, they pass down behaviours. They transmit what to touch, what to preserve, and what to leave undisturbed. Over millennia, the Temple Mount has been treated not as an ordinary ruin, but as a boundary one that successive cultures approached with reverence, fear and restraint, even when the original reasons for that restraint were no longer understood. This is how long-term knowledge survives without explanation. It becomes embedded in custom rather than instruction. When meaning is too complex, too disruptive, or too dependent on context, it cannot be safely summarized. Instead, it is protected through habit. Silence becomes protocol. Avoidance becomes law. What looks like superstition from the outside often functions as inherited risk management. From this perspective, the temple was not simply destroyed or lost, it was retired. Its role within human systems changed as societies themselves changed. When shared frameworks of meaning collapsed, the temple could no longer function as an integrative structure. Its continued operation would have required cultural coherence that no longer existed. Rather than allowing misinterpretation or misuse, the system was allowed to fade from direct engagement. History shows that this pattern repeats. Complex technologies and knowledge systems vanish not when they are attacked, but when the social conditions required to support them disappear. Roman concrete, Greek fire, ancient navigational techniques, none were intentionally erased. They became unusable because the networks that sustained them collapsed. The temple appears to belong to this category, but at a deeper level. It was not a technique that vanished, but a mode of understanding. That mode emphasized alignment rather than control. It relied on proportion, repetition, and resonance rather than command. Such systems do not scale easily through empire or doctrine. They require participation rather than obedience. When societies move towards centralized authority, these systems become incompatible with prevailing power structures. They are not banned, they are sidelined. What remains remarkable is how consistently this sidelining was maintained. Empires rose and fell, religions transformed, technologies advanced. Yet the core restraint surrounding the Temple Mount persisted. This continuity suggests that the restraint was not ideological but structural. Each generation inherited a boundary it did not fully understand yet chose not to violate. In modern terms, this resembles the way certain scientific thresholds are treated. There are experiments that can be performed but are not. There are discoveries that could be pursued but are delayed. The decision is rarely framed as ignorance. It is framed as responsibility. When potential consequences are unclear, or irreversible restraint becomes the rational choice. The fascination with uncovering a final secret reflects a modern bias toward closure. We expect mysteries to end with answers. Yet some systems do not resolve. They persist. They shape trajectories rather than delivering conclusions. The temple's role may have been to orient civilization toward balance, not to provide information that could be consumed or exploited. If so, then the repeated framing of the temple as a container of relics or forbidden knowledge may be a projection. Objects are familiar. They fit within existing models of discovery and ownership. Systems do not. Systems demand participation, humility, and adaptation. They resist extraction. This resistance may explain why attempts to reduce the temple's significance to a single artifact have always felt insufficient. Each proposed solution, Treasure Ark scrolls, feels smaller than the weight of the silence that surrounds the site. The scale of restraint suggests that what was preserved was not an item, but a relationship between knowledge and society. Modern science increasingly grapples with similar relationships. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and climate intervention all raise questions not of capability but of readiness. The challenge is no longer whether something can be done, but whether it should be done and under what conditions. These questions cannot be answered by data alone. They require frameworks of meaning and responsibility. Ancient systems may have addressed this challenge differently, embedding restraint directly into structure and tradition. Instead of ethics committees, they used sacred boundaries. Instead of regulatory agencies, they relied on inherited taboo. While crude by modern standards, the effect was similar delay until understanding matured. Seen in this light, the temple's silence becomes less mysterious and more instructive. It demonstrates that not all knowledge seeks exposure. Some knowledge seeks continuity. It waits for context in which it can be integrated rather than weaponized or commodified. The irony is that modern inquiry may be approaching such a context independently. As disciplines converge and reductionist models give way to systems thinking, humanity is rediscovering principles long embedded in ancient structures. Balance over dominance, feedback over force, relationship over hierarchy. These ideas are not new, they are returning. When recognition finally occurs, it may not feel like a revelation. It may feel like recollection without memory, a sense that something once known has been reached again from another direction. At that moment, the temple's absence will no longer feel like a loss. It will feel like a transition that served its purpose. The final lesson, then, is not about what lies beneath stone, but about how civilizations choose to carry knowledge forward. Preservation does not always mean visibility. Survival does not always mean continuity of form. Sometimes the most enduring legacy is a boundary that prevents collapse until understanding catches up. In that sense, the story does not end with Solomon's Temple. It continues wherever humanity learns to balance curiosity with restraint, discovery with responsibility, and power with proportion. The temple was never only a place. It was a decision one repeated across generations to let certain truths wait. The history of Solomon's Temple ultimately converges on a question that reaches beyond archaeology, religion or legend. It asks how civilizations decide what kind of knowledge should endure and what kind must be delayed. Across thousands of years, the Temple Mount has remained one of the most symbolically charged and materially restricted locations on Earth. This persistence cannot be explained by faith alone. Faith changes, power shifts. Yet the restraint surrounding this place has survived conquest, reform, and modernity itself. Such continuity suggests that something deeper than belief has been preserved. Ancient societies did not separate knowledge from survival. Observation, construction, ritual, and governance were interwoven responses to an unpredictable world. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, and celestial events were not abstract risks, but lived realities. In this context, sacred structures were not merely places of worship. They were instruments for stability. Geometry, orientation, and proportion encoded practical understanding into environments that shaped behavior without explanation. Knowledge was embedded where it could not easily be distorted. Solomon's Temple, as described in surviving sources, fits this model. Its emphasis on measurement, alignment, and internal order exceeds what is necessary for symbolism alone. The repetition of dimensions and materials implies sensitivity to configuration. In engineering terms, such specificity suggests that deviation mattered. Systems designed to regulate resonance, movement, or perception rely on precision. Once altered, they lose function. This fragility may explain why the temple's legacy was handled with such caution after its destruction. When the temple ceased to exist as a functioning structure, its role within society could no longer be maintained. The cultural coherence required to support it had fractured. In such moments, civilizations face a choice. They may attempt to preserve fragments, openly risking misinterpretation, or they may restrict access entirely, allowing understanding to lie dormant until conditions improve. The long silence surrounding the Temple Mount suggests the latter path was chosen. This decision reflects an advanced form of risk awareness. Knowledge does not operate in isolation. It interacts with social structures, belief systems, and power dynamics. When these contexts are unstable, even accurate knowledge can produce destructive outcomes. History provides many examples of technologies and ideas introduced prematurely accelerating collapse rather than preventing it. Ancient custodians may have recognized this danger, intuitively choosing restraint over revelation. Over time, restraint transformed into tradition. What began as deliberate postponement hardened into prohibition. The reason for caution faded, but the behavior persisted. This is how complex systems protect themselves across generations. Explanation is not required. Repetition is sufficient. The Temple Mount became a boundary remembered through action, rather than understanding. Meanwhile, the principles once embodied by the temple did not vanish. They dispersed. Architecture preserved proportion. Music retained harmonic structure. Myth encoded cycles. Each fragment survived independently, stripped of context, but not of function. This dispersion prevented central control while ensuring continuity. No single authority could suppress the system completely, because no single authority possessed it entirely. Modern science increasingly recognizes this pattern. Complex systems are resilient when distributed. Centralization creates efficiency but increases vulnerability. Fragmentation reduces clarity but enhances survival. The temple's disappearance appears to have initiated such a transition, converting a centralized system of alignment into a distributed set of principles embedded across culture. As centuries passed, these principles were rediscovered repeatedly. Builders observed that certain spaces produced calm. Mathematicians found recurring ratios in nature. Astronomers identified cycles governing stability. None of these discoveries required access to the temple itself. They emerged through observation and synthesis. What was once encoded spatially became articulated conceptually. This gradual rediscovery suggests that the temple was never intended to be reopened. Its purpose was not preservation of content, but initiation of a process. Once its principles were seeded into culture, the structure itself became unnecessary. Continued access might even have been counterproductive, inviting literalism where abstraction was required. The modern obsession with uncovering a final secret may therefore reflect a misunderstanding. We search for artifacts because artifacts fit within familiar narratives of discovery. Systems do not. Systems demand integration. They resist extraction. The silence beneath the Temple Mount frustrates expectation because there is nothing discrete to retrieve. The system is already in motion elsewhere. As contemporary inquiry advances, the distance between ancient intuition and modern theory continues to shrink. Fields once considered separate now intersect. Physics encounters philosophy. Neuroscience meets architecture. Ecology converges with systems theory. These convergences echo principles long embedded in sacred structures: balance, feedback, proportion, recurrence. The language has changed, but the logic remains. This convergence raises an uncomfortable implication. Humanity may already be approaching the understanding that ancient systems were designed to protect. If so, the temple's silence has fulfilled its role. It delayed exposure until the intellectual and ethical tools required for integration emerged organically. No guardians were needed. Complexity itself enforced restraint. In this light, the Temple Mount stands as a reminder rather than a mystery. It marks a point where civilization once chose continuity over immediacy. That choice has been honoured consciously or not across generations. The endurance of that restraint suggests wisdom rather than ignorance. The final lesson of Solomon's Temple is therefore not hidden beneath stone. It resides in the pattern of human behaviour surrounding it. Knowledge capable of reshaping foundational assumptions must be allowed to mature alongside society itself. When revelation outruns responsibility, collapse follows. When restraint guides transmission, survival becomes possible. The temple was not a vault, it was a threshold. Once crossed prematurely, it could destabilize. Left untouched, it allowed humanity to approach the same understanding from many directions at its own pace. That approach may now be nearing completion, not through excavation, but through synthesis. In the end, the greatest secret preserved by Solomon's Temple may be the recognition that some truths endure best when they are not revealed at all, but allowed to re-emerge slowly, distributed across time, waiting for minds capable of recognizing them without needing to possess them. The question of Solomon's Temple has endured not because of what is missing, but because of how consistently absence has been maintained. Across 3 millennia, civilizations with radically different beliefs, technologies, and political priorities have treated the Temple Mount not as an ordinary ruin, but as a boundary. This continuity is statistically improbable if explained by theology alone. Belief systems fracture, reform, and replace one another. Yet restraint persists. Such persistence points to a deeper inheritance, a long-term cultural behaviour shaped by perceived risk rather than devotion. Ancient societies were acutely aware of existential instability. Climate shifts, floods, earthquakes, famine, and sudden collapse were not theoretical possibilities, but lived experiences. Survival depended on pattern recognition across generations. Knowledge that increased resilience was preserved. Knowledge that increased volatility was managed carefully. Sacred architecture emerged from this environment not merely as a religious expression, but as a stabilizing technology. Geometry, orientation, and proportion encoded empirical understanding into physical form, shaping collective behavior without requiring literacy or interpretation. Descriptions of Solomon's Temple emphasize order more than symbolism. Measurements are repeated with precision. Materials are specified not for extravagance, but for placement and alignment. Such attention suggests that configuration mattered. In modern engineering, this level of specificity usually indicates a system sensitive to small changes. Structures designed to influence acoustics, movement, or perception depend on exact relationships. When altered, they lose function. This sensitivity provides a plausible explanation for the extraordinary caution exercised after the temple's destruction. Once the structure could no longer operate as intended, continued access would have risked misunderstanding or misuse. The loss of the temple coincided with a broader shift in how societies organized meaning. Experiential systems grounded in space and movement gradually gave way to textual systems, grounded in interpretation and authority. Text is portable, scalable, and easier to control. Space is fixed, immersive, and resistant to abstraction. When social coherence weakens, text survives more easily than architecture. The transition from temple-centered practice to scripture-centered belief reflects this adaptive shift. What could no longer be supported experientially was condensed into narrative, yet condensation came at a cost. Narrative preserves memory, but it strips context. The functional dimension of ancient systems became symbolic. Ritual replaced calibration. Over time, explanation overshadowed experience. The temple's disappearance marks not only the loss of a building, but the loss of a mode of knowing that depended on shared participation rather than instruction. The persistence of restraint suggests that this loss was recognized even if not articulated. Rather than attempting to preserve fragments openly, societies chose avoidance. Avoidance prevented reduction. It allowed the system's coherence to remain intact in principle, even as its form vanished. This strategy resembles how complex technologies are sometimes abandoned rather than dismantled. When infrastructure collapses, continued use becomes dangerous. Knowledge does not disappear, but it becomes dormant. Dormancy, however, does not equal extinction. The principles once embodied by the temple dispersed into culture. Architecture retained proportion. Music preserved harmonic ratios. Myth encoded cycles of destruction and renewal. Each fragment functioned independently stripped of integrative context, but still effective within its domain. This dispersion created resilience. No single authority controlled the whole. No single collapse could erase it entirely. This pattern aligns with modern understandings of complex systems. Centralized systems are efficient but fragile. Distributed systems are ambiguous but robust. The temple appears to have transitioned from a centralized integrative structure into a distributed cultural substrate. Its disappearance initiated this transition, ensuring survival through fragmentation. Centuries later, these fragments began to reconnect through independent inquiry. Renaissance architects rediscovered proportion. Scientists identified recurring ratios in nature. Astronomers recognized cycles governing stability. None of these discoveries required access to the temple. They emerged from observation and synthesis. What had once been embedded in stone resurfaced through mathematics and theory. This gradual convergence challenges the assumption that ancient knowledge was primitive. It suggests instead that ancient systems approach reality holistically, integrating environment, perception, and structure without formal abstraction. Modern science, having travelled a different path, is now arriving at similar insights through specialization and recombination. The languages differ, but the underlying patterns converge. The enduring silence surrounding the Temple Mount must be understood within this context. Silence prevented premature closure. It kept the system from being reduced to doctrine or artifact. It allowed rediscovery to occur organically distributed across disciplines and cultures. In effect, silence functioned as a temporal buffer delaying synthesis, until intellectual and ethical frameworks matured. The Knights Templar occupy a critical position within this narrative. Their sudden rise, long residence near the Temple Mount, and subsequent suppression suggest contact with something structurally significant rather than materially valuable. They did not behave like treasure seekers. They behaved like custodians of a system they did not fully control. Their silence under pressure indicates recognition of a boundary they chose not to cross publicly. The charges later levelled against them focused on secrecy rather than crime. This distinction matters. Societies tolerate wealth and power more readily than ambiguity. Ambiguity undermines authority because it resists categorization. A group that operates on principles not easily articulated invites suspicion regardless of intent. The Templars' destruction fits a pattern of containment rather than refutation. Importantly, no definitive counterclaim was ever produced. No authority declared conclusively that nothing of significance existed beneath the temple. Instead, the narrative solidified around taboo. Taboo is not proof of absence, it is evidence of unresolved risk. In scientific practice, taboos often mark areas where uncertainty intersects with potential consequence. Modern technology has narrowed the gap between observation and disturbance. Non-invasive scanning methods can now map subsurface structures with high precision. Similar techniques have revealed hidden chambers in other ancient sites once thought fully understood. The reluctance to apply these methods freely beneath the Temple Mount suggests anticipation of outcomes that would challenge existing frameworks. Yet even if anomalies were confirmed, interpretation would remain the greater challenge. Data alone does not generate meaning. Meaning emerges through synthesis. Discoveries that alter foundational assumptions require more than evidence. They require cultural readiness. Without that readiness, knowledge destabilizes rather than enlightens. This brings the inquiry to its central implication. The temple's legacy is not about what was hidden, but about how societies manage knowledge that redefines origins. Evidence of prior advanced systems' cyclical collapse, or non-linear progress, would challenge deeply embedded narratives of uniqueness and ascent. Such challenges reverberate beyond academia. They affect governance identity and moral authority. Ancient custodians may have recognized this long before modern terminology existed. Their response was not destruction, but deferral. They allowed the system to dissolve into fragments, trusting that rediscovery would occur when conditions permitted integration rather than exploitation. This trust required patience measured in centuries. The modern world now stands at a similar threshold. Interdisciplinary convergence suggests that synthesis is approaching. Physics encounters limits of reductionism. Biology grapples with emergence. Cognitive science recognizes embodiment. Architecture revisits neurospatial effects. These developments echo principles long embedded in sacred structures. The temple system, if it existed, is reassembling without excavation. This reassembly reframes the idea of inheritance. Inheritance is not transmission of content, but preservation of potential. The temple preserved potential by withdrawing. Its absence forced humanity to rediscover alignment through its own evolving tools. This process ensured comprehension rather than imitation. The final lesson is therefore procedural, not historical. Knowledge that reshapes foundational perception must mature alongside society. Premature revelation destabilizes. Distributed rediscovery stabilizes. Silence can be a form of stewardship. Solomon's temple viewed through this lens was never meant to be recovered as an object. It was meant to function as a decision repeated across generations, to let understanding arrive when humanity could meet it without collapsing under its weight. The endurance of that decision more than any artifact is the temple's true legacy. The long continuity of restraint surrounding Solomon's temple reaches its final clarity when viewed not as an unresolved mystery, but as a completed cycle. What began as a structure embedded in stone became over centuries a behavior embedded in civilization. The temple ceased to function as a place, yet its influence persisted as a pattern of decision-making. This persistence suggests that the most important element was never the building itself, but the collective choice to treat certain knowledge differently from all others. Civilizations are often judged by what they build and what they leave behind. Less attention is given to what they deliberately choose not to uncover. Yet restraint is one of the clearest indicators of long-term intelligence. It implies anticipation of consequences beyond a single generation. The repeated choice to preserve silence around the Temple Mount, even as belief systems transformed and political power shifted, indicates a shared intuition that some forms of understanding could not be absorbed safely under prevailing conditions. Over time, this intuition outlived its original rationale. Later societies inherited the boundary without fully understanding why it existed. But inheritance does not require comprehension to remain effective. In complex systems, behaviors can persist long after their initiating causes fade. This is true in biology, culture, and technology alike. The temple's silence functioned in this way, operating as a safeguard that did not depend on explanation. The gradual fragmentation of the temple's original framework ensured its survival. By dissolving into architecture, mathematics, and later scientific intuition, its principles became impossible to eradicate. No conquest could erase proportion from stone. No doctrine could remove harmony from sound. No censorship could eliminate recurrence from nature. What was once centralized became ubiquitous. This transformation protected the system from misuse. Centralized knowledge invites domination. Distributed knowledge invites rediscovery. Each culture encountered fragments independently interpreting them through its own language and needs. This prevented sudden synthesis, but guaranteed endurance. The system remained active without becoming dangerous. Modern inquiry increasingly reveals the consequences of this approach. As fields converge, patterns once scattered begin to align. Not through recovery of ancient artifacts, but through independent recognition. The convergence is slow, uneven, and often contested yet unmistakable. Systems thinking replaces linear certainty. Feedback replaces hierarchy. Balance replaces control. These shifts mirror principles long embedded in ancient sacred structures. The fascination with uncovering a final secret beneath Solomon's temple may therefore reflect a misunderstanding of how the legacy was designed to operate. There may be no final disclosure waiting underground. No single revelation capable of resolving the mystery. The temple's role was not to deliver answers, but to delay them until they could be integrated without collapse. This reframing resolves a long-standing paradox. Why would a civilization capable of constructing such a structure allow it to vanish? Why would later powers choose restraint over excavation? The answer lies in function. The temple was not a container of static truth. It was a regulator of relationship between knowledge and society. Once that relationship could no longer be maintained, the structure withdrew from use. Withdrawal is not failure. In many systems, withdrawal is the mechanism that ensures long-term viability. Seeds lie dormant until conditions are right. Knowledge behaves similarly. When exposed too early, it destabilizes. When withheld too long, it stagnates. The balance lies in timing. The endurance of silence suggests that timing mattered more than possession. Those who inherited the boundary understood even dimly that reopening it prematurely would cause more harm than good. Their restraint was not based on fear of the unknown, but respect for its impact. As modern civilization approaches a moment of synthesis, the temple's legacy appears less enigmatic and more instructive. It demonstrates that progress does not always move forward by uncovering the past. Sometimes it advances by rediscovering principles through new pathways. When that rediscovery occurs organically, it integrates more deeply and resists misuse. The final implication is sobering. Humanity may never solve the mystery of Solomon's temple in the way it expects. There may be no closure, no final proof, no definitive excavation. Instead, understanding may arrive gradually distributed across disciplines embedded in practice rather than proclaimed in doctrine. In that sense, the temple's silence is not a void, but a guide. It teaches that endurance sometimes requires disappearance, and that wisdom sometimes survives best when it refuses to be named too soon. This perspective invites a final reconsideration of what it means for knowledge to survive. Survival is often imagined as preservation in recognizable form, yet history repeatedly demonstrates that such preservation is fragile. Libraries burn, monuments collapse, archives are rewritten. What endures is not what is guarded most visibly, but what is embedded most subtly into behavior, structure, and habit. The temple's true continuity may lie precisely in this subtlety. By withdrawing from direct access, the system associated with the temple avoided becoming an object of competition or domination. No empire could claim it fully. No doctrine could monopolize its meaning. Instead, its principles continued to surface wherever humans sought stability amid uncertainty. In moments of collapse, builders returned to proportion. In moments of confusion, thinkers returned to cycles. In moments of excess, societies rediscovered balance as necessity rather than ideology. This pattern suggests that the temple's silence was not passive. It was active restraint. It shaped the pace at which understanding could re-emerge, ensuring that rediscovery occurred through necessity rather than curiosity alone. Necessity imposes humility. It forces adaptation rather than exploitation. Knowledge rediscovered under such conditions is more likely to be integrated responsibly. Modern civilization now confronts challenges that mirror those faced by ancient societies, though at greater scale. Environmental instability, technological acceleration, and systemic complexity all demand frameworks that emphasize balance over expansion. In this context, the reappearance of principles long embedded in sacred architecture feels less coincidental and more inevitable. Humanity is rediscovering alignment not because it seeks the past, but because it needs coherence. If the temple has a final lesson, it is this: continuity does not require permanence of form. It requires patience with timing. Wisdom is not always what is revealed, but what is allowed to wait. The silence that endured for centuries was not emptiness. It was space for understanding to mature, for fragments to reconnect, and for recognition to arrive without force. Seen this way, the temple's story does not close. It dissolves into the present moment, reminding us that some truths are not inherited whole, but assembled slowly when society is finally prepared to live with their consequences. The final stage of this inquiry does not arrive as an answer, but as a recognition of pattern. Across the long arc of history, Solomon's temple has remained influential precisely because it withdrew from visibility. What survived was not stone or inscription, but a way of deciding when knowledge should advance and when it should pause. That decision repeated itself through generations long after its origin was forgotten. Civilizations tend to believe that progress depends on accumulation. More data, more access, more explanation. Yet the record of collapse suggests the opposite is often true. Societies fall not from a lack of knowledge, but from knowledge applied faster than systems can absorb. The temple's silence appears to have functioned as a counterweight to this tendency, slowing exposure rather than accelerating it. Ancient builders operated within environments defined by instability. Seasonal failure, seismic activity, and sudden climate shifts shaped collective memory. Survival demanded restraint as much as innovation. In that context, sacred structures were not merely symbolic. They were instruments of pacing, embedding understanding into space while limiting its circulation. When the temple ceased to function physically, its role did not disappear. It transformed. Restraint became tradition. Avoidance became law. Over time, the original rationale dissolved, but the behavior endured. This is how complex safeguards persist. They do not require belief, only repetition. The dispersion of the temple's underlying principles ensured resilience. Architecture retained proportion. Music preserved harmony. Myth carried cycles of renewal and collapse. Each fragment survived independently, stripped of explanation, but not of effect. No authority could erase them entirely because no authority controlled them completely. Modern science now encounters similar truths through different pathways. Systems theory reveals that stability emerges from relationship rather than dominance. Neuroscience confirms that environment shapes perception. Physics uncovers resonance as a governing force across scale. These insights echo principles long embedded in ancient structures rediscovered without reference to their origin. This convergence suggests that the temple's disappearance was not a loss, but a delay. Delay allowed rediscovery to occur through necessity rather than inheritance. Knowledge earned through reconstruction integrates more deeply than knowledge received intact. Fragmentation forced humanity to approach coherence gradually. The continued restraint surrounding the Temple Mount reflects this same logic. Reopening the site prematurely would impose closure on a system designed to remain open. Closure simplifies. Simplification distorts. Silence preserved complexity. The desire for a final secret beneath the temple may therefore be misplaced. There may be nothing discrete to uncover. The system already operates through patterns visible across disciplines. Excavation would not deliver meaning. Integration would. This reframing alters the role of mystery. Mystery is not an absence of truth, but a protection of timing. It prevents premature certainty. It keeps inquiry distributed rather than centralized. In that sense, mystery stabilizes rather than obstructs. History shows that the most disruptive discoveries are those that redefine origins. They alter identity before they offer utility. Ancient custodians may have understood this, intuitively choosing restraint over revelation. Their choice echoes in the silence that followed. As modern civilization approaches its own threshold of synthesis, the temple's legacy becomes clearer. It models patience. It demonstrates that wisdom can be preserved by withholding, not by hiding, but by allowing understanding to mature alongside society. The final lesson is therefore not historical but procedural. Knowledge that reshapes foundations must be paced. Distributed rediscovery outlasts centralized disclosure. Silence can function as stewardship. Solomon's temple endures not as a ruin to be uncovered, but as a decision repeated across time. That decision was to let truth arrive when it could be carried without collapse. Seen whole, the temple story resolves into guidance rather than revelation. It teaches that endurance depends on timing, not possession, on integration, not exposure. Knowledge that reshapes origins must mature with society, or it accelerates collapse. Silence in this case was stewardship, an inherited pause that preserved complexity until frameworks could bear it. Today, as disciplines converge and patterns align, the legacy no longer requires excavation. It asks for synthesis, humility, and restraint. What survives is not a secret beneath stone, but a method for carrying truth forward, without breaking the world that must hold it with care and collective responsibility. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The lantern grows dim, and the stones beneath our feet return to shadow. We've moved through buried chambers, through centuries of silence, through questions that resist being sealed. And now, like all ancient paths, this one softens into quiet. The final secret of Solomon's Temple does not end here. It lingers. In the way power fears memory, in the way knowledge survives by becoming invisible, in the way history leaves gaps not because it forgot, but because it chose to pause. The universe does this often. It withholds answers not to deny us truth, but to let us grow into it. Against the vastness of time, we are small, brief, and yet capable of wonder. Like particles drifting through gravity we barely understand, carried by forces older than language. Some truths don't demand answers. They ask only for stillness, for attention, for the humility to listen. Perhaps the temple was never meant to be opened again. Perhaps its message was never meant to be owned. Some knowledge lives best in silence, where it can endure without being broken by certainty. For now, let the dust settle. Let the questions rest where they belong. Time will continue its slow orbit. Memory will keep whispering, and the universe will remain awake long after we sleep. Rest well, traveller. Stay curious. The silence will keep watch.